Now we're all set. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here this evening. I am Regina Palm, the Marie and Hugh Half Curator of American and European Art, and my first order of business is to request that you please silence your cell phones. With that said, to say that it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker would be an understatement. There are many art historians, past and present, who are doing tremendous work, but there really are only a handful whose work actually changes our field, and Dr. Lisa Farrington is indeed one of those scholars. I first became aware of her work as a graduate student in 2005 when her seminal book, Creating Their Own Image, The History of African American Women Artists, was published by Oxford University Press, and it kind of changed my world. It was the first comprehensive history of its time to allow for a survey of these often historically overlooked and underrepresented artists come to light. Dr. Farrington specializes in African American art, Haitian art, and women's art, and is one of only six full professors in the United States of America to specialize in African American art history. She is a distinguished professor emerita in the Department of Art and Music at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. Dr. Farrington is also one of the major scholars of Faith Ringgold, as well as the author of several books, and I've come to learn that she is still actively writing and authoring books, and she has a very heavy schedule moving forward. In her talk tonight, entitled Envisioning Blackness, she will discuss several of the artists in the exhibition American Made, including Loïs Jones and Elizabeth Catlett, who I have just recently learned moments ago have stood at this very same podium that I am back in 1987 giving lectures. So if I seem a little bit fangirl or a bit off tonight, it's a big night. I didn't realize I was standing in such hollow ground, if you will, and soon to be filled by Dr. Lisa Farrington. Tonight she will, as I said, be exploring some of the artists in the show, talking about the Harlem Renaissance as well as negritude. So if you all will please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Farrington.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I'm really excited to be here. I've been having the most wonderful day. I wanted to take a moment to tell those of you who haven't seen the show that it has been curated in the most innovative and exciting way by Regina Palm. And I had the privilege of walking through it with her, and I'm just very impressed by the way the museum has put that show together here. So I usually run on and on because I have so much to say, but I'm going to read today because we're on a time schedule and I don't want to go over time. But you know, there's lots of time for Q&A at the end, so I hope you enjoy what you're about to hear. So in New York City, between the wars, that is the First and Second World War, the African American visual arts flourished with the same vigor as the fields of drama, dance, music, and literature. For a brief moment in the 1920s and 30s, Harlem was the nexus of an art movement, the effects of which were felt across the country and around the world, in cities such as Atlanta, Chicago, Kansas City, San Francisco, Paris, and Berlin. For the first time in history, the interests of art dealers, patrons, and curators. Am I loud enough? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I should be closer. I do this. I've taught for 32 years. You'd think I'd know how to speak in front of an audience. Anyway, it sounds better now. The Harlem Renaissance visual arts came to be really because of the work of two men in particular, Alain Locke, who you see on your left, who was a Rhodes Scholar, a Harvard PhD, and the main arbiter of Harlem Renaissance visual arts, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois. Both of these men advocated for Black artists to create art that would uplift the race and contradict stereotypes, which were rampant at the time. An unprecedented number of African American visual artists were able to achieve qualified levels of success during this period, due in no small measure also to the Harmon Foundation. Am I going backwards? Oops. Okay. So the Harmon Foundation was founded by a real estate developer named William E. Harmon in 1922 to award prizes to African Americans for achievement in the visual arts and other fields. African American artists gained national and even international reputations with the help of the foundation, whose art prizes and traveling exhibits were designed to bring African American creativity to the attention of a broad-based public and to give financial support to the artists themselves. A regular contributor to the foundation's exhibitions was Loïs Mailou Jones, who coincidentally was my teacher when I was in college. In fact, she received an honorable mention from the Harmon Foundation for a 1930 drawing that she did, a portrait of one of her students that you see here. Jones began her vocational pursuits shortly before the Harlem Renaissance in 1919 as a freshman at the High School of Practical Arts in Boston. Both precocious and prolific, she mounted her first one-woman show at the tender age of 17. She also, at the same time, was working as an assistant to the dress designer and Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD, professor Grace Ripley, who you see on your right. Through Ripley, Jones discovered African costumes and masks and quickly incorporated their unique qualities into her own art. Jones spent afternoons and Saturdays taking drawing classes at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, where she sharpened her skills as a designer. After high school, Jones continued at the Boston Museum School on a 4-year scholarship, where she majored in design and frequently won art prizes. Intensely dedicated to her artistic education, Jones spent her last year of college taking additional design courses at the Boston Normal School, which is today the Massachusetts College of Art, from which she received a design certificate in 1927, simultaneously graduating with honors from the Boston Museum School. By the time Jones received her BFA, she had become a skilled artist and designer. Her nude from 1927 is an example of the artist's prowess and her consummate knowledge of the human figure. Noteworthy in this extraordinary image is its orientation, facing away from the viewer so that the proverbial, quote, male gaze is foiled. Rather than titillating her audience with purely physical delights, Jones forces her viewers to become aware of the introspective nature of her subject, of the woman's pensiveness, her isolation, and her humanity. On the basis of well-crafted images such as nude, Jones received a scholarship for graduate study at the Boston Designers Art School. There she majored in textile design and began selling her designs to prominent New York fabric houses, including F.A. Foster and Schumacher Company. She actually sold her designs by getting a friend of hers who wasn't Black to bring the designs to New York so that they didn't know that the maker, small fortune doing that. She realized that textile design, however, as a textile designer, she was not going to become well known because textile design was considered a low art as opposed to a high or fine art. And she was not likely to enter the historical roster of great museums. Fame was something Jones craved, and her own words attest to this. She said once, "Only the name of the design was known, never the artist." That bothered me because I was doing all this work and not getting any recognition. And I realized I would have to think seriously about changing my specialty if I were to become known by name. Jones would make good her promise to become known by name within a very few years when she shifted her focus from design to painting. Soon after completing graduate school, Jones sought employment in the form of a teaching fellowship at her alma mater, the Boston Museum School. Despite her exemplary academic record and professional successes, however, her application was turned down. Jones was instead advised to travel south, quote, to help her people, advice which disconcerted her because it implied that the only appropriate place for her to pursue teaching was in the Black South, rather than in her own New England home. Jones did, however, go south in 1928 after meeting Charlotte Hawkins Brown, director of the elite and today historic private Black high school and junior college in Sedalia, North Carolina, the Palmer Memorial Institute. Jones persuaded Brown to hire her to chair a new art department, which Jones fashioned after the Boston Museum School curriculum. During her first year at Palmer, Jones invited James V. Herring, chair of the art department at the historically Black Howard University in Washington, D.C., to come to Sedalia as a guest lecturer. Impressed with Jones's administration of the art department at Palmer, Herring invited her to join the recently formed Howard University Fine Arts Department, which she did in 1930. Not coincidentally, the Harlem Renaissance leader, Elaine Locke, was chair of the Howard University Philosophy Department in his historic 1925 articles, The Art of the Ancestors and Legacy of the Ancestral Arts. Jones's art from the 1930s, such as Les Fétiches, reveals the artist's knowledge of both French Cubism and the African sculpture which inspired that movement. Jones studied African art firsthand in Paris at the Musée de l'Homme. Depicted in Les Fétiches are Dan, Yaouré, and Baoulé masks and a talisman, all from the Ivory Coast, as well as a striped Kifwebe mask or headdress from the Congo. These boldly rendered images within the vernacular of Cubism represent a marriage of African and European artistic traditions typical of the Harlem Renaissance, and they reveal Jones's personal aesthetic requisites. Les Fétiches was completed while Jones was in Paris on sabbatical leave from Howard University, where, by the way, Jones taught for 50 years, which is how I managed to catch her just before she retired. Jones lived in Paris for a year at the end of the 1930s. This is her Paris studio that you're looking at. She spent her time painting en plein air, or outdoors, in the Impressionist manner along the banks of the Seine River, and studying at the Académie Julienne. There she met French symbolist painter Émile Bernard, who provided her with invaluable criticism as well as storage space for her easel and canvases in his own studio. Jones' Paris works alternated between Impressionist and post-Impressionist street scenes and still lifes. She progressed so rapidly as a painter that by the end of her sabbatical year, she had completed more than 40 works and exhibited at the French government Salon de Printemps, or Spring's exhibition, the Galerie Charpentier, which is today Sotheby's auction house, and the Société des Artistes Français. Jones' time in Paris marked a turning point in her career, giving her the space to become a painter of, as critics put it, strength and accomplishment. In Paris, Jones also benefited from a French parallel to the Harlem Renaissance known as negritude. This literary and visual arts phenomenon, like the New Negro movement of the Harlem Renaissance, exalted African culture and espoused a belief in an exceptional, quote, Negro personality. Specifically, negritude artists proclaimed the existence of a mythic African soul that was sensitive, sensual, and spiritual. Simultaneously, negritude thinkers like other Pan-Africanists decided that they needed to protest or decry the global oppression of African people. The negritude movement was propelled by a group of Black intellectuals from French West Africa and the Antilles who lived in Paris, including Birago Diop, René Marin, Léopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, Léon Dumas, and a South African painter named Gerard Sekoto. A coincident group in Haiti known as the Indigenists, with which Jones also became acquainted, included writer Jean Price Mars and Pétion Sabin, who was also a visual artist. Negritude writing, which was mostly poetry, as well as painting, was expressionistic, colorful, and deliberate in its articulation and purpose, and not surrealist as some historians have suggested. I don't know why they suggested that. Just look at the paintings. And it found on the and it focused on the moral supremacy and dignity of African people, all elements that were evident in Jones's work. After her first year abroad, Jones was honored with a solo exhibit of her Paris works at the Robert C. Vose Gallery in Boston. The exhibition was well received by critics who described Jones as, quote, the leading Negro artist of the day. And they declared her paintings to be imbued with the qualities the Impressionists sought to achieve through painting with broad strokes and summary patches of color which catch the effect of sunlight upon surfaces. In the wake of her Paris and Boston successes, Jones capitalized on her emerging reputation by submitting works to major museums, such as her painting Paris le Soir, which is on view here at the San Antonio Museum, and it's much better to see it live upstairs. In 1955, Jones was awarded the Diplôme de Création de l'Ordre National by President Magloire of Haiti, the home of her artist husband, Louis V. Pierre Noël, where she taught at the Port-au-Prince Centre d'Art and at the Foyer des Arts Plastiques. And she painted many indigenous-inspired scenes of Haitian peasants. In fact, after learning that Vodou, which is the scholarly way to say voodoo, was in fact a valid religion not associated with black magic, which merged Benin and Congo gods with Catholic icons, she painted a number of works, such as this of the voodoo goddess La Sirène, honoring that grassroots religion. Later in her career, Jones continued to exhibit in dozens of group and solo shows at home and in the annual Paris salons, the thematic influence of the Harlem Renaissance remaining evident in her work. A painting completed after a trip to Africa when Jones was in her 60s, Ubi Girl, reveals her interest in West African themes as well as her unremitting sense of design. At the end of her life, Jones's career was chronicled in the biography, The Life and Art of Loïs Mailou Jones, and in her painting, Les Fétiches, which graced the cover of the historic Smithsonian Institution catalog on African American art, Free Within Ourselves. Another artist worthy to mention as part of the Harlem Renaissance movement is Boston artist Allan Rohan Crite, also represented in the American Made exhibition here. He created paintings inspired by the everyday lives of the African Americans he knew. Crite's style can best be described as social realist, a description that defines a genre of art that chronologically overlapped the Harlem Renaissance in its latter years and maintained popularity throughout the years of the Great Depression, due in great part to President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. A sweeping financial recovery program designed to combat the Depression, the New Deal comprised major bailout and welfare strategies, including bank and state loans, the establishment of Social Security and the FDIC, and the construction of low-cost public housing for the working class. Not the least of these relief programs was the Work Progress Administration, or WPA, which employed millions of citizens in road construction, park maintenance, building projects, educational programs, and the arts, including theater, music, writing, and visual art. Progressive in its outreach, the WPA's Federal Art Project, or FAP, employed 10,000 painters, sculptors, graphic designers, and art teachers, 15% of whom were African American, higher than the percentage of African Americans in the country at the time. The WPFAP also funded 100 community art centers in 22 states, many of which were hosted in Black communities. Among these were Karamu House in Cleveland, Heritage House in Detroit, the Southside Community Arts Center in Chicago, and the Harlem Art Center in New York. Crite was a beneficiary of the FAP, or Federal Art Project, and best known for his lifelong devotion to Black genre subjects, or everyday subjects, particularly of the working class Black community in which he lived for nearly 100 years. In Crite's words, quote, "I've only done one piece of work in my whole life, and I am still at it. I wanted to paint people of color as normal humans." Born in New Jersey, Crite's family moved to South Boston a year after his birth. With the encouragement of his mother, who was an amateur poet and lover of art, he spent many childhood hours contemplating the collection at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, just as had Jones. Crite also took classes at the Children's Art Center, which was located in Boston's oldest settlement house, United South End Settlements. And he studied privately with MIT artist-engineer Charles Woodbury, who was one of the most popular art instructors of the time and who published Crite's practice sketches in his 1925 teaching manual, The Art of Seeing, Mental Training Through Drawing. While still a student, Crite exhibited with the Boston Society of Independent Artists and in the Harmon Foundation exhibits from 1930 to 1933. Again, like Jones, but a decade later, in the mid-1930s, Crite studied art at the Boston Museum School, completing their program in 1936. He worked for the easel division of the FAP and was included in the 1936 New Horizons in American Art exhibit of the Federal Art Project artists held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In the 1940s, Crite exhibited his work at Boston's Grace Horn Galleries, Margaret Brown Gallery, and the Boston Athenaeum, to which in the 1970s he donated the bulk of his paintings. Later, Crite earned his living as a technical illustrator for the Department of the Navy and at the Boston Shipyard, as an interior mural painter for Rambush Decorating Company, the firm responsible for the interior decoration of New York's Roxy Theater and Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and as an illustrator for the Boston Globe, the NAACP Crisis Magazine, and the National Urban League magazine Opportunity. In 1968, Crite completed a second bachelor's degree in history and science at the Harvard Extension School, where he also worked part-time as a librarian for the Grossman Library, which now displays his works in their permanent collection. He subsequently taught at Oberlin, Regis, and Roxbury Community Colleges, while continuing his educational pursuits at the Boston University and the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. In the 1960s, Crite opened his townhouse on Columbus Avenue in the South End to younger colleagues, and for decades, it served as a hub for artists and alike. Referred to by the press as the dean and the granddaddy of New England's African American art community, in 1986, the intersection near Crite's home was officially named Allan Rohan Crite Square. There's even a park named after him at this point. That same year, he was one of several distinguished Harvard graduates to receive the Harvard University 350th Anniversary Alumni Medal. Crite's other academic awards include honorary PhDs from Boston's Suffolk University, Emmanuel College, and the Massachusetts College of Art. In the 1990s, with the help of his wife, art consultant Jackie Cox, Crite founded the Allan Rohan Crite Research Institute, now a museum, in his home as a way to preserve his art. Now let's return for a minute to our discussion of social realism. By the 1950s, abstract expressionism had replaced social realism as the preeminent style of American art. Those who did not embrace the new abstraction struggled to find a place in the art world at mid-century, which would explain why Crite had to go to work for the Navy Yard. So African Americans whose artistic capabilities had been celebrated during the 1930s and early 40s lost their footing in the art world. In the words of historians Norma Browdy and Mary Garrard, the narrow window of opportunity that had briefly opened during the economic hard times of the 1930s quickly snapped shut in the late 40s with the emergence of the abstract expressionist movement. Not surprisingly, the WP in his third term, when conservative elements took control of Congress. FAP art programs which had dared to support women and minorities with salaries equal to those of white men came under attack as, quote, wasteful, propagandistic, and filled with communists. The WPA Federal Art Project was especially targeted because it had received the sponsorship of the American Artists Congress, a Communist Party affiliate that worked to prevent art censorship and to minimize WP advocacy of military agendas. Congress branded the WPA a bed of communist activity, and by 1943 it had lost popular support. Those associated with the program automatically became suspect as un-American, and an accusation that anticipated the indictments of the McCarthy era to come. With the commencement of the Cold War between the US and the former Soviet Union, the two nations, I better drink some water, I'm sorry. I hate to stop my flow like this. Okay. So these two nations began to struggle for control of the imperial control of the globe and to view one another with increasing hostility. By the early 1950s, growing anti-Russian and anti-communist sentiment culminated in the rise of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. Spearheaded by Senator Joseph McCarthy, the HUAC targeted for investigation political progressives of the socialist and communist parties who were or had been affiliated with the WPA. While socialism and communism were legitimate political parties at that time and sanctioned during the 1930s, as philosophies, both were now viewed with outright suspicion. Often without substantiation, the HUAC publicly accused so-called red radicals of alleged communist agitation, which the HUAC perceived as a threat to democracy and certainly to capitalism. The HUAC succeeded in destroying or impeding the careers of many high-profile Americans whose censorship garnered the most public attention. A number of African Americans were included in this group, such as prizefighter Canada Lee, writer Langston Hughes, and actors Paul Robeson, Ruby Dee, and Ossie Davis. The HUAC also maintained blacklists of rosters of citizens who were suspected of harboring communist sympathies. Many Americans lived in fear that their names might appear on these rosters, which could, and often did, cost them their careers, their jobs, and even their friends. As a result of the HUAC's activities, an atmosphere of acute suspicion and paranoia prevailed in the US for nearly a decade. African American artists, whether or not they had actually been associated with the Communist Party or the WPA, were viewed with particular skepticism. So too was the social realist content that dominated much of their artwork, despite the fact that the style had enjoyed over a decade of official government approval. The proletariat themes of social realism became synonymous with communist concepts of collective labor and social equality, and were subsequently scorned by the new politically conservative art establishment. Abstract expressionism represented the philosophical and methodological converse of social realist art, and by the 1950s was being lauded for its implicit denunciation of political agendas. Social realist African American artists were barred access to art dealers and galleries, and their occupational prospects dwindled significantly. Many found the climate of the U.S. untenable and opted to relocate either to Europe or to Mexico. A number of expatriates favored Mexico, which had had its own communist revolution in 1910 and still favored social realist art. Elizabeth Catlett was one such artist. Born in Washington, D.C., Catlett enrolled in the Howard University Department of Art in 1931, where she came into contact with several key players of the Harlem Renaissance, including department chairs James Herring. Oops. Sorry, guys. Got to go back a bit. Okay. Including department chairs James Herring and Elaine Locke, and of course Loïs Jones, pictured standing next to Catlett on the left. I think the left side of that photograph. Aren't they cute? They're so young. Anyway, while a university student, Catlett secured a commission to complete a mural design on the subject of Harlem from the WPA. Upon graduation, she was also very political, that here she is protesting lynching with other Howard students with the nooses around their neck. Upon graduation in 1935, Catlett began a teaching career in Durham, North Carolina, in the public school system, where she campaigned to raise the salaries of African American teachers who were paid only half as much as their white colleagues. Soon, however, Catlett became discontented with the inadequate income and heavy demands of public school teaching, which left her little time for her own creative work. Realizing that teaching at the college level was less time-consuming, Catlett resolved to upgrade her professional qualifications. She abandoned Durham and enrolled in the State University of Iowa, where she earned a Master of Fine Arts degree necessary for university teaching. At Iowa, Catlett studied with the distinguished social realist and WPA artist Grant Wood, famed for his stylized renderings of the Iowa countryside and for his sardonic characterization of a rural American couple in the 1930 painting American Gothic. And of course, I learned today that there is a Grant Wood in the show upstairs, still life. Wood further acted as Catlett's, he was empathetic, I should say, to Catlett's position as one of very few women or African American students at Iowa, and he made a special effort to guide and advise her. He also acted as her defender when she learned in her second year at Iowa that she might not be able to receive a Master of Fine Arts degree, but would only receive the non-art master's degree because, according to her department chair, she had not completed the required number of undergraduate printmaking courses at Iowa, although she had taken several such courses at Howard. There was apparently some resistance to granting Catlett what would be Iowa's very first MFA degree. Fortunately, Wood was able to convince the art chair to grant the fine arts degree. As a result, Catlett became one of the first two persons ever to receive that degree. The other was her own sculpture instructor, Harry Stinson. Good old Harry. In 1940, after securing her master's, Catlett joined the faculty at Dillard University in New Orleans, also an historically black college, founded with the aid of WPA funds. There, Catlett headed the art department, but while she found teaching at Dillard intellectually and creatively compelling, she could not say the same for her day-to-day existence as a woman of color in the Deep South. A parochial university administration railed against Catlett's attempts to organize nude drawing classes, for example. And she and her students were refused admission to the Delgado Museum, today the New Orleans Museum of Art, because it was located in City Park, which allowed white visitors only. Another troubling incident occurred when the university board mandated that Dillard faculty had to teach throughout the summer without additional pay. After barely 2 years of residency in Louisiana, Catlett resigned. During this period and soon thereafter, Catlett participated in the Atlanta University annual exhibits as both an artist and a juror. The Atlanta annuals were initiated by African American artist Hale Woodruff to carry on the tradition of the Harmon Foundation exhibits, which had been discontinued. For nearly 30 years, the annuals provided a national forum for African American art. Catlett's reputation grew when her work was included in the 1940 Chicago American Negro Expo, where she won first prize for this limestone sculpture of a Negro mother and child, which was her master's degree thesis, a monumental rendering of a seated semi-nude Black woman embracing a toddler. Negro Mother and Child was so well received that Alain Locke, who chaired the Expo committee, featured the work in his 1940 book, The Negro in Art, as did art historian and Howard University art chair James Porter 3 years later when he published Modern Negro Art. Catlett spent the summer of 1941 studying sculpture at the Art Institute of Chicago and lithography at the WPA-sponsored Southside Community Arts Center. Like the Harlem Community Arts Center, this Chicago counterpart was a meeting place for African American artists during what became known as Chicago's Harlem Renaissance. Its opening was attended by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who you see here talking to Alain Locke. Included in the Southside groups were leading lights such as dancer Katherine Dunham, photographer Gordon Parks, sculptor Richmond Barthé, and two-dimensional artists Archibald Motley, Elzea Corter, and Charles White, the latter of whom married Catlett later that year. White was renowned in his own right and went on to teach at both Howard University and at the Otis Art Institute in California. During his brief marriage to Catlett, the two shared similar artistic styles and political concerns that were nurtured in the collectivist environment of the Southside Center, as well as an interest in creating epic imagery of the African American working class. A number of artists at the Southside Community Center were Communist Party members who sustained a vested interest in collectivist art activity. Center founder Margaret Burroughs, who went on to direct the DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago, described her own aesthetic objectives. Quote, "I wish my art to speak not only for my people, but for all humanity. My subject matter is social commentary, and it seeks to improve the condition of life for all people." As a group, Southside members endorsed art with radical political implications, art that would act as a weapon for social change. Their anti-capitalist and anti-elitist WPA politics left a lasting impression on Catlett while she was there. Although she opted not to join the Communist Party herself, its promise of racial and social equality mirrored Catlett's own commitment to African American enfranchisement and informed her art for the rest of her life. In the spring of 1942, Catlett relocated with White to New York, where she studied at the famed Art Students League. Between 44 and 46, she taught at New York's Jefferson School and at the progressive George Washington Carver School, both of which were administered by socialist polemicists who sought to provide educational opportunities to the Black population of Harlem. The Carver School, where Catlett expended the greater part of her energies, was supervised by Gwendolyn Bennett, one-time director of the Harlem Community Art Center. Bennett was joined in her sponsorship of the Carver School by Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and by City Council member Benjamin Davis, who was an affiliate of the National Central Committee of the Communist Party, relationships that further cemented Catlett's belief in social equity. In 1945 and 46, Catlett was awarded a Rosenwald Foundation Fellowship to produce a series of works on the subject of Black women. In order to devote her time to the creative process, Catlett discontinued her work at Carver, and in her second year there, she resigned, and she used the Rosenwald funds to study in Mexico. She was particularly drawn to the socialist art for which the Mexican muralists such as Diego Rivera were recognized. Fortuitously for Catlett, the public art movement in Mexico, which had been triggered by that country's communist revolution 2 decades before, and its call for social reforms, was still teeming when Catlett arrived. In Mexico, Catlett enrolled in the Escuela de Pintura y Escultura, known by its nickname, the Esmeralda. There she met Diego Rivera and immersed herself in the Mexican school agenda, which fused elements of indigenous Central American and Spanish artistic traditions to create visual representations with a national identity known as Mexicanidad. Mexicanidad artists reacted against the bourgeois notion of art exclusively for the rich, alternatively offering art for the people in the form of monumental public murals and affordable prints and graphics that addressed the concerns of the Mexican working class, much the same as the WPA had done. Specifically, Catlett allied herself with the Taller Gráfica Popular, or TGP, a Mexican school alliance and print workshop founded in 1937, which provided graphic design to anti-fascist, popular, and labor coalitions. Catlett would remain with the TGP for more than 2 decades. Catlett became enamored of Mexico, where she felt less hampered by racial bigotry. I feel like a person in Mexico. When I am in the States, I feel very conscious of what my race is. Catlett also fell in love with a fellow TGP member, Francisco Pancho Mora, and in 1946 briefly returned to the U.S. to divorce White. I won't mention that White had cheated on her a few times. Soon thereafter, she settled permanently in Mexico and married Mora. And with Mora, she had 3 sons, and the 2 remained together as spouses and creative colleagues for more than half a century. Under the sway of the Mexicanidad aesthetic and in the supportive atmosphere of the TGP, Catlett completed her Rosenwald Fund assignment, a series of 15 lino cuts entitled The Negro Woman, and later renamed The Black Woman Speaks. The first image in the series, I Am the Negro Woman, depicts a close-up view of the face of a young woman as if seen through the zoom lens of a camera, whose penetrating gaze is focused decisively on a distant, unseen objective. When I first saw this, I immediately thought of this next image, the face of Michelangelo's David. The image is evocative of the David who, upon seeing his enemy Goliath, prepares mentally to fell him and to take his own rightful place as the king of a great nation. The visual similarity between the Catlett and Michelangelo faces, that is, 3/4 turned heads, eyes swiveled in their sockets, and furrowed brows, indicates an allegorical likeness. In that Catlett's woman, too, faces an enemy, human injustice and suffering, which she, the female incarnation of David, is determined to vanquish with equal resolve. The series, which reads like an autobiographical narrative, suggests Catlett's growing commitment to the subject of Black women. I am the Negro woman. I have always worked hard in America, in the fields, in other folks' homes. I have given the world my songs. In Sojourner Truth, I fought for the rights of women as well as Negroes. In Harriet Tubman, I helped hundreds to freedom. In Phyllis Wheatley, I proved intellectual equality in the midst of slavery. My role has been important in the struggle to organize the unorganized. I have studied in ever-increasing numbers. My reward has been bars between me and the rest of my land. I have special reservations, special houses, and a special fear for my loved ones. My right is a future of equality with other Americans. The series, as these titles suggest, is dedicated to the archetypal Black woman, but also to several explicit historic heroines, such as 19th century women's right advocate Sojourner Truth, neoclassical poet and slave Phyllis Wheatley, and Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman. In the 1950s, the artist, not surprisingly, found herself at the mercy of the HUAC because of her various associations with socialist and communist groups. Her tribulations also stemmed from political and aesthetic changes that were taking place in Mexico by the 1950s. Not long after the onset of abstract expressionism in the US, the Mexican predilection for social realist art of the type produced by the WPA and the TGP was beginning to wane. Younger Mexican artists like Rufino Tamayo allied themselves with abstract expressionism and with what they saw as the loftier aims of art for art's sake rather than art for the people. Social realism and the, quote, anachronistic nationalism of the Mexicanidad school were soon considered obsolete. Due to its commitment to left-wing politics, the TGP was designated a Communist Front organization by the HUAC. As such, TGP members, excluding Catlett, who was still an American citizen, were barred from entry into the US. Catlett was ordered in 1955, just about when this picture was taken, to submit a written declaration of her political affiliations and to name others for the purpose of the HUAC blacklist, whom she knew to be affiliated with the Communist Party. Catlett refused to comply and, in due course, was imprisoned as a foreign agitator by Mexican authorities in collusion with the HUAC. In protest, Catlett made the radical decision to renounce her American citizenship upon her release from prison. In 1962, she became a citizen of Mexico, at which time the US government promptly declared her a, quote, undesirable alien. And for the next 10 years, they prohibited her from returning to her home, the United States. In the early 1960s, Catlett was named the first woman to head the Department of Sculpture at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma in Mexico City. And later, after a 10-year banishment, she was at last permitted to revisit the US in 1971, after officials from the Studio Museum in Harlem, who were mounting a major Catlett retrospective, successfully lobbied the State Department. The exhibit and the attendant publicity catapulted Catlett into the national spotlight, where she remained until her death in 2012 and beyond. These three Black artists constitute a remarkable group of talents who overcame a variety of barriers to achieve a lofty goal, that of reconstituting the negative image of Blacks in America. The racial, economic, and socio-political impediments that these artists faced in pursuit of their chosen vocations were profound. Yet the idiosyncratic circumstances of the time periods during which they came of age, that of the Harlem Renaissance and of social realism, allowed for the flowering of their artistic genius and caused Americans to sit up and take notice, seriously, of the breadth of African American creativity for the first time in US history. Thank you. So I think we have a Q&A. You doing the Q&A on my own? Okay, Q&A me. Does anybody have any questions? I know that was when I say, does anybody have any questions? I'll wait. Yes. He never moved. Thank you. So that was Harriet Kelly, who, by the way, I have your collection catalog on my shelf at home. Um, she and her late husband are major collectors of African American art, and she is just a serious advocate for the field. So please give her a hand. Is- Oh, well, if you send it to me, I'll sign it and mail it back. Okay, I'm going to repeat what Harriet said because first of all, Mrs. Kelly said that she met all three of the artists that we discussed today over her lifetime of collecting. And she said that she's reading my book. I assume it's the History of African American Art, Oxford University Press. And she says everybody should buy it. So, any other questions? Yes. No, the question was to explain negritude a little further, and whether or not it was a clique of people who were living the experience of racial oppression. Is that what you're saying? A group? Hmm. I understand what you're saying. Uh, well, negritude wasn't exactly that because we remember we're talking 100 years ago. So very few people were saying anything nice about people of color. So it wasn't so much that those poets, mostly poets, writers, activists, and some visual artists, they had several agendas. One was to create artwork that represented what they believed was a Pan-Africanist experience of Blackness during colonialism and then imperialism later. Um, and what was happening to Black artists at the time was that they were being encouraged, because that's where they studied in schools that were European, mostly if they studied at all. They were being encouraged to create European style art. And they wanted to create their own school of art that was representative of the masses, or the proletariat, if you will, of that uplifted, not uplifted, that honored the idea of African culture when everybody else was denigrating it. They wanted people to know that, for example, religions like voodoo were not black magic that was invented to make the practitioners, to demonize the practitioners, but that it was a marriage of a Fan religion from the Benin and different gods from the Congo, and that it became a legitimate religion that was practiced under different names all over Central and South America. But the other thing was that artists like the indigenous writers, Jean Price Mars, for example, he wrote a wonderful book called Thus Spoke the Uncle. It talked, it glorified regular people, not just the upper class. And regular often meant minorities. So there was a relationship between negritude and, for example, the mid-19th century realist movement in France. That painting movement, led by Courbet, Gustave Courbet, those artists chose to paint portraits of stonemasons and, ordinary working people, Daumier, people in the third class carriage on the train, Honoré Daumier. So a whole group of artists in 1849-50 in Paris got together and decided, we're not going to paint fancy portraits of kings and queens. We're going to paint our people, the real people that make up our country. That's what negritude really was doing. They were trying to show people that just because you're not wealthy, just because you didn't go to a fancy school, doesn't mean you're not a worthy human, worthy of talking about, writing about, worthy of being known. So does that help? Okay. Yeah, sure. That was a great question. I never had that question before, and I was a professor for 30 plus years. Any other questions? Yes.
What do you think about the Catholic? What do you think about the Catholic sculpture in the exhibition, and how does that fall within her body of work?
Well, that beautiful sculpture, it's a bronze seated woman with a green patina. I think curator Palm and I were talking about that today. Even though she's seated, this is not your typical representation of a woman. Think of all the sculptures of women that you've seen created by men. This woman is sitting, she's stretching out her back a bit, kind of like a Degas work, really. Her legs, her knees are open, her skirt dropped between her knees. This is not a romantic, sexy woman. This is a real working woman. And so there are two differences here. Elizabeth Catlett, as we have already discussed, was an advocate of the worker and of people of color in her art. She was also an advocate of real women. I mean, when she was arrested in Mexico, she had 3 children in the house and her husband wasn't there. She had to run across the hall and get the neighbor to come and watch her kids so she can go to jail. So she, when women create images of themselves, and okay, I'm not talking about all the gender possibilities here, but when women create images of themselves, they don't create posed, fake, sexualized, objectified representations for the most part. They create images of people who just happen to be women. So that's what I think about that sculpture. Did I repeat the question? Oh, no, you had the mic. Okay, good. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Why did abstract expressionism replace social realism? And you use the expression fill that void. So that was not the goal of the art community when they embraced abstract expressionism. It was not their goal to fill the void that social realism left. The goal was to eradicate social realism and not to replace it with anything like it, and to return the appreciation and support of art to the upper classes, people who had education, people who could go to museums, people who knew the artists, people who were interested in art that did not do anything to support the working class. So how do you do that? Anything figurative would be in some way related to all people. Completely non-objective art was considered apolitical, non-political. So art and politics were seen by the far right as a dangerous combination because it was so powerful as an agenda to change, as a tool to change people's minds about helping the poor, helping the working class. And as the Great Depression ended, because of course when everybody's broke, then social realism is a great work of art, because great style of art, because it represents everybody. But of course, with the rebound of the economy in the 40s, this idea that people with wealth should be spending their money helping those who struggle, well, the wealthy people weren't happy with that. So they advocated for art that was as distanced from ordinary people as possible. For example, Diego Rivera, who we spoke of briefly, was in New York in the 30s. He painted a 40-foot long, 20-foot tall mural about the ability for the rank and file, for modern technology, and for the worker to change the world for the better. He depicted in that mural the West, images of people sipping martinis and ignoring their children and doing other posh things in their fabulous 20s clothes. And on the other side of the mural, it was called Man, Controller of the Universe. On the other side of the mural was communism. Everything was in order. People stood in rows. They all wore similar clothing. They were very, organized. And there were two Rockefellers involved with that, Blanchett and David. And I don't know why they hired Diego Rivera, a card-carrying communist, to paint that mural in Rockefeller Center, a monument to capitalism, but they did. But there was so much backlash that they decided that the mural, which was, was on giant panels, it could be removed. It was a fresco, that it should be removed to the Museum of Modern Art, which, as little as it's known, the Rockefellers control that. So it's not a public museum, it's a family museum. So the hatred for anything communist, because communism, if you've ever read the manifesto, it advocates for sexual, racial equality. So, there's no rich and there's no poor, theoretically. Of course, that never works because humans are so flawed, but that means, greedy. But the backlash against helping the poor, you know this yourselves, many people feel welfare, social programs are just a waste of money, and why are they taxing me so much? Why doesn't that guy go get a job? That kind of thinking. So there's a lot of people like that, thinking that very same thing in the early 1940s and even in the 30s. So before those murals could be removed to the Museum of Modern Art, in the middle of the night, workmen with pickaxes were hired to come in and destroy the entire mural, just hack it off the wall. And that's exactly what they did. So this was a fight. This wasn't, oh, let's replace this with that. This was a fight. Let's kill all art that supports social progress and replace it with art that the working class has nothing to do with. And that was a very successful campaign. Hope that answers your question. You're welcome. Oh, I didn't mention. Yes, there are photographs of the original, but Diego went back to Mexico and was commissioned by the Mexican government to repaint it exactly the same at the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City. And it's there now, 40 by 20 feet. But he added one portrait to the western side of at the party. They have the cocktail party, and it's David Rockefeller. So if you ever go to Mexico, you've got to go to the Palace of Fine Arts, because these murals, there's one goes 30 feet up the stairs, which is the history of Mexico, which honors the indigenous Mexicans, you know, Incas and Aztecs and Mayans. Then there's another one on the other side. It looks kind of like a liberty leading the people, but it's a 40-foot semi-nude woman breaking chains. They're the largest breasts I've ever seen. And then on the back wall is the replaced Diego Rivera mural. So great question. I meant to say that, but you see, I get sidetracked easily. Great questions. Did I repeat that question? Oh, good. Oh, good. Trying to follow those instructions. Anybody else? Yes. Well, they're doing really well. This all comes on the heels of George Floyd's murder, when all things African American seemed to become important to people who felt enough is enough. Enough oppression, enough abuse, it's enough already. And in the art world, that manifested as a huge increase in the value of African American art at auctions and private sales, and a radical increase in the number of African American artists who are being recognized by museums and curators and art historians and collectors. So enjoy it while you got it, folks. I don't think it'll last forever, but no, we know it won't last forever, but we're in a good moment for Black art right now. If you bought Black art 10 years ago, it's time to go to the auction house. I didn't mean that, Mrs. Kelly. She's giving me a look. It was a joke. Yes, any other questions? Good, because I'm hungry.